Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. On today's show, we're going to discuss the OSCE meeting in Milan and the Yellow Vest protests in France. Now, expectedly, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe meeting in Milan has included a war of words between Ukraine and its Western backers on the one hand and Russia on the other. At issue is not only the naval clash in the Black Sea, but also looming large is the U.S. warning to Russia vis-a-vis the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Dr. Cornelius, who is the head of the Center for OSCE Research and is also part of the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Cornelius, thanks for taking your time out to speak to us here in the Scope. Let's start off, if we may, Cornelius, with the basics of the OSCE meeting. Going into it, obviously, there was already that clash that took place in the Black Sea, Russia seizing those Ukrainian naval ships as well as crew. What do you make right now vis-a-vis the mood, the Normandy format, when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine issue?
The Normandy format has been trying to reach an agreement on the situation in Ukraine. So far, it has not managed, obviously, to stop the ceasefire violations, to comprehensively work towards an implementation of the Minsk II agreement. It is an important format, in addition to another format, the Trilateral Contact Group. It is important to talk. The Normandy format comprises Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. But at the same time, the current situation is highly dangerous, and there is a risk of a further increase in escalation.
Indeed. And what did you make of the entire issue in the Black Sea? I know there are a lot of details there, obviously, what we can talk about, but as the macro issue, really, Russia saying, for its point of view, that the Ukrainians are trying to provoke it. Do you think that Ukraine would want to provoke Russia in such a fashion?
It's very hard to understand the decision-making process in Ukraine and in Russia. There are voices that say that both President Poroshenko and President Putin at this point might even benefit from a slight escalation of the situation. There will be elections in Ukraine very soon. Poroshenko's ratings are very low, and he might benefit from a rally around the flag effect. He is under strong domestic pressure from other political candidates. President Putin is not doing too well domestically either. So we might be in a situation where the leaders of these two countries might lack a strong interest to work towards sustainable peace.
But I imagine, though, that the OSCE itself and the other countries that are part of Europe, of course, would rather just see these two countries get along, wouldn't they? So I imagine that possibly the political will would not exist within Europe to support any war. Am I right in that?
It is, the OSCE is a consensus-based organization, which means all participating states have to agree when it comes to decision-making. And the OSCE includes Russia and Ukraine. That is why smaller formats, the Trilateral Contact Group, where the OSCE is mediating, and the Normandy format are important, because in these smaller formats, discussions tend to be less tailored to the global audience or to the entire OSCE, and hopefully more productive. But it is the OSCE is playing an important role in Ukraine in providing this special monitoring mission, which is a very large mission, a de facto peacekeeping operation, which is monitoring the frequent violations of the ceasefire and providing information to the OSCE Secretariat and to participating states. But there is only so much the OSCE can do.
Right. So I'm wondering then, going forward, when we look at this entire issue between Russia and Ukraine, it's been quite long-standing at this point in time now, since Yanukovych was overthrown, since those Maidan protests took place. A significant amount of time has passed since then. And as you pointed out, Poroshenko isn't doing very well in the ratings himself. What do you think Europe is thinking vis-a-vis its support for Ukraine at this point in time, as it currently stands? Do you think that there are concerns at this point about Ukrainian governance?
There are definitely concerns about Ukrainian governance. This is something, by the way, that Russia keeps on pointing at when it talks about the Minsk II agreement, that it's demanding internal reforms, or in particular some form of autonomy for the eastern regions, the two oblasts now controlled by anti-government forces. Western countries such as Germany are putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian government to reform institutions, the police, the courts, the regulating agencies, anti-corruption bodies. And Ukraine has made moves towards reform, but at the same time, it is suffering from a legacy of practices still from the communist times and from the time after the Cold War, which make it very hard to implement reform.
And you know, we Cornelius, have the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Wes Mitchell, who is attended this OSCE summit in Milan, and has obviously made quite a harsh statement against Russia, saying that it was Russia's actions in East Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula that have caused, I'm quoting right now the official, that Europe's largest humanitarian crisis in a generation occurred because of this crisis. Do you agree with that terminology, in the sense that the U.S. seems to be putting all the blame on Russia, which is something that other countries within Europe and obviously part of the OSCE as well have also put the blame for the situation on the Russian Federation?
Well, the Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine is undeniable. There is plenty of evidence for that. It is clear that Russia has violated international law by occupying, de facto invading the Crimea. At the same time, Russian policies, Western states, including the United States, tend to deny that Western policies, that Russian policies are also a response to Western policies. So one should not simply dismiss Russian concerns about Eastern enlargement, about Kosovo, Iraq, etc. This is not the same as excusing or legitimizing Russian actions which violate international laws. But policies need to be seen in an overall context, and that context includes Western decisions.
Very well. Let's see if we can add another voice to this conversation. We're also now joined by Dr. Eleonora Ambrosetti. I hope I got that name right, Eleonora. She is a research fellow of the Russia, Caucasus, and Central Asia program with the Institute for International Political Studies, the ISPI, and she is joining us live now. Eleonora, thanks for taking your time out. I know you have a busy schedule as well to discuss this topic further. Eleonora, I want to ask you first about this OSCE meeting. Obviously, a war of words has already played out between Ukraine and the United States, especially on one hand, and Russia on the other, vis-a-vis what's happened in the Black Sea and otherwise. What did you make of that?
The meeting is not over yet, but as far as we know, the meeting, as you said, provided yet another opportunity for Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. to pin the blame on each other and present their own view of the story, especially of the Kerch incident that happened a few days ago. You see, the OSCE is a great forum because it puts all these countries together: Ukraine, Russia, the U.S., all European countries are members, and this is a fantastic opportunity in theory to discuss divergences, but at the same time, it is also problematic to come up with a common position because there is mutual blocking. So everything is just, it is what it is. It is a forum for all the parties involved to give their own view, but in terms of concrete actions, there is not so much to expect. And in this case, Ukraine tried to make the case for more sanctions towards Russia. The Ukraine foreign minister said explicitly that declarations are not enough and more restrictive actions are needed in order to tackle Russia's aggression. And Russia, on the other hand, presented the Kursk incident as a provocation on the part of the Ukrainian government. So nothing new.
Right. So Eleonora, I'm wondering right now, when Ukraine wants more restrictive actions on Russia, and I know that in the OSCE format, a consensus is required, as you pointed out, and as our other guest, Cornelius, also pointed out. Do you think that apart from the OSCE, though, even beyond the OSCE, just looking at Europe as a whole, do you think the political will exists in Europe to further restrict Russia?
Well, there is already a huge debate around the economic sanctions, especially that Europe has imposed on Russia. I will now focus on the EU. The EU has imposed different types of sanctions towards Russia. There are economic sanctions, which are the most problematic for some European member states. There are some diplomatic actions, for instance, interrupting the EU-Russia strategic dialogue. There are restrictions to the economic cooperation with Russia. So there's plenty of different types of actions. Of course, the attention here is focused on economic sanctions because those are the ones that are supposedly cause more harm to European countries, especially to some of them. And talking about Italy, there are a lot of Italian companies that complain about not only the sanctions, but the counter-sanctions that Russia imposed as a response to European sanctions. So there is, in the country, but not only in Italy, a lot of opposition, growing opposition towards the sanctions. And of course, the current government in Italy is openly against sanctions. It has never blocked the European common action so far, but it's constantly threatening to do so, and it's lobbying against the sanctions. So I don't think that at the time being there is the political will to go ahead with new sanctions. But of course, this is something that doesn't depend only on Italy or the EU as a whole. If the US pushes to have more restrictive sanctions, probably the EU will also consider increasing its restrictive measures.
Cornelius, I wanted to bring you back in, and I wanted to ask you, Cornelius, if you agree with Eleonora that the economic sanctions, and it would make sense, obviously, that would be the biggest concern for Europe as a whole. But where you're sitting as well in Germany, Cornelius, I wonder what the German point of view is right now on any more restrictive actions on Russia, including, for example, economic sanctions.
Germany has been supporting these economic sanctions. At the same time, Germany wants dialogue with Russia, and I think what has just been said by our other guest is very important. The West is no longer the West. Western states have various viewpoints, and there's a risk of a division within NATO. And we already see a divergence of policies within the EU towards Russia. Some states are more conciliatory. Other states say no business as usual. After Ukraine, increased pressure on Russia. We need more deterrence. And Russia is inherently hostile. So Western states are not speaking with a common voice.
Okay, so Eleonora, looking at this from the Russian point of view, if we may for a moment, the Russians would say that the Ukrainians are being provocative in the Black Sea, for example, that they purposefully would have sent those ships in the fashion that they did. Do you think, Eleonora, that there are concerns, even within the OSCE possibly, about Ukrainian actions?
Undoubtedly, there is a situation where Ukraine is going through some delicate political times. You all know that the presidential elections are going to be held in March, and the incumbent president is suffering from heavy popularity, from a heavy popularity crisis. So the popularity rates are currently very low. I think for this month, for November, it was in between 5% and 10% popularity, the percentage of citizens that would trust Poroshenko. So the status quo is not an option that would serve the interests of Poroshenko best. So there is actually the possibility that Poroshenko use this incident, maybe not provoked, but exploited this incident to try and have a better performance at the polls. The imposition of the martial law is a case in point. Obviously, the parliament restricted a little bit the initial proposal by Poroshenko to have the martial law imposed on the whole of the country for 2 months. Now it's only on some provinces, 10 out of 27, the ones that border Russia or that border regions where, or countries where Russia has troops, like Transnistria, and only for 1 month. But this is, even this reduced application of the martial law is concerning, because it probably the international community didn't expect this incident to cause such an extreme measure. And of course, the political risk about having the martial law imposed, so having an increased powers to restrict civil liberties, to possibly persecute political opponents, etc., is of great concern. There are a lot of critics, actually, that were moved to Poroshenko internationally because of his actions. So there is the concern that he used the incident in a controversial way.
Okay, so because I know you have to leave early, Eleonora, so I'm going to put my question to you. I'm wondering, Eleonora, at this point in time, do you think that there is a gap that now exists between how Europe wants to deal with Russia, be it through the OSCE or other such mechanisms, and between how the United States wants to deal with Russia? Do you think there's a gap there?
Well, there's always been a gap. We've always had a different relation and a different approach to Russia. First of all, because we have economic interdependence with Russia, which is something that the U.S. don't have. I think Russia is the 30th trade partner for the U.S. For us, it's like the second and the first source of energy. So, it is the third overall after U.S. and China. But in any case, there is a very, very strong trade, cultural, political relation. And of course, the sanctions for us were more painful to bear. But at the same time, the U.S. has a very complex relation with Russia. And the current government, Trump's government, is a very, very delicate balance between the long-standing opposition to Russia, the long-standing fear and distrust, and the personal relation that that Trump has with Putin, which was displayed, for instance, at the Helsinki meeting. On the one hand, you have this president that advocated for a closer relation with Russia, and you have personal bonds, you have political scandals, you have corruption scandals taking place. Look at the latest episode of the Russiagate involving Trump's ex-lawyer Cohen, and there is actually a very delicate situation there. And on the other hand, you have the long-standing opposition of the U.S. establishment and the fear and the distrust. So it is actually a very different relation with Russia. It can't be otherwise. So, of course, the responses may be different as well.
Very well, Eleonora, we appreciate joining us and sharing your insight with us on this very important topic. Cornelius, I wanted to go to you because I think it's one thing that Eleonora there mentioned at the end, Cornelius, was the relationship between Donald Trump very specifically and Russia. Because, there are a lot of accusations, of course, Russiagate, as she mentioned. But then at the same time, Cornelius, we now have this entire issue of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And I'm wondering, what do you make of that entire controversy? Because it's almost mixed messages, isn't it, coming out of the Trump administration, where Trump himself seemingly wants better relations with Russia, but people like John Bolton possibly do not.
Yes, there seems to be very little chance for saving the INF Treaty. The U.S. has been concerned about alleged Russian violations of the INF Treaty for many years, even going back to the time before Donald Trump. Now, there are people within the administration, you mentioned John Bolton, who are generally not interested in multilateral arrangements, in binding down the U.S. in any way. And they are certainly influencing that policy. At the same time, Trump is impossible to predict. He's an impulsive person, and he regards international relations through a very personalized lens. But having said that, there are hardly any people anymore who still give the INF Treaty a chance.
Okay, so let's talk about possibly why. Why do you think the U.S. or Russia would want to walk away from such an important treaty? Because as we would all understand, I imagine, that mutually assured destruction is a very real reality even in today's world. So why would either of these countries want to walk away from this? What do they gain from that?
Well, the United States is concerned about alleged Russian violations. It says that Russia has developed a weapon system with ranges over 500 kilometers. The INF Treaty bans intermediate nuclear weapons in the range between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers. Russia is denying that allegation. The US, one of the main motivations of the US canceling or threatening to cancel the treaty may not be so much Russia, but rather China. China possesses weapon systems that can hit US targets in the Pacific area, Japan, Guam. And China is not bound by that treaty. China has made it clear that it is not interested in such a treaty. So the US, especially the hardliners within the administration, possibly also within Congress and the companies producing weapons, argue that the US needs a weapon system in order to fill that gap. There is another important aspect regarding deterrence. Some within Europe, for example, say that the current deterrent relationship is no longer credible because the only weapons that are now available are strategic nuclear weapons. And then the old issue comes up again that was already an issue during the Cold War. Is the United States going to risk New York for a European city that is under attack by by Russia. So in a way, we're back to some of the old questions that everybody was hoping would be gone by now. And NATO is developing new scenarios that some of which are reminders of the bad old days, with deterrence at its center. Russia does not seem to have a great interest in saving the INF treaty either, because militarily it can be beneficial to deploy such intermediate range nuclear weapons. At the same time, it must be said the US has never provided credible public information on Russia's violation of the INF treaty. And many still remember United States allegations of Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction. So in order to make that case credible, the US needs to provide public information.
So as our guests there were talking about a very important aspect, of course, about the OSCE meeting, about this entire issue vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine, is that of the INF Treaty and where things are heading between the United States and Russia on that front. As Cornelius mentioned in his last answer there, the China factor is an extremely important one. This is an issue which we'll, of course, keep a very close eye on in the coming days and months, and we'll come back to you with that at an opportune moment. Next up, though, after this short break, is our next segment, that, of course, of the protests in France. Stay with us for that.